Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. Cal Thomas has been covering Washington for nearly 50 years through his nationally syndicated columns, several books, and his frequent television appearances. He's our guest this week for an hour-long conversation that recaps the political events he's witnessed and the presidents and lawmakers he's covered, which are all summed up in his new book, A Watchman in the Night. Our conversation will begin in just a moment. Cal Thomas, next year is going to mark the 40th anniversary of your nationally syndicated column. What have been your goals over the years with it?
Well, Susan, I think the goal has been to show that a standard exists in many areas of life. Economic standards, government standards, the Constitution, moral standards that have always worked for every generation that has tried them. And by violating them, we have put ourselves in massive debt, a weakened foreign policy, in my judgment, leadership that now no longer enjoys the respect of large numbers of Americans. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. So what I've tried to do with my column over the years is to assert a standard that has worked in the past, and we don't live in the past, but we can learn from the past, and to suggest that this is the way to go for a more healthy and balanced future for individuals, for their families, and for the nation.
One of the many things that has changed dramatically over the past 4 decades is the business that we're both in. I'm wondering what you think the role and future of syndicated columns are.
Probably not very good, with newspapers closing. At the height of my column, I was in over 500 newspapers, and now so many are closing down, or they are getting rid of material content and going up on prices, which seems to be rather crazy to me. I like to say that USA Today now, you can see the weather page from the front page. It's so thin. I think, it's the only profession mentioned in the Constitution, the First Amendment. The founders, even though George Washington called them infamous scribblers, knew that a healthy and free press was essential to a strong democracy. And Gallup has shown in recent polling that trust in the media, all of it, is at a record low or near a record low, down along the lines of Congress. And I think that's very dangerous for the healthy democracy. Young people are not reading newspapers. They're getting their information on social media and from friends and other sources. And I think that's not good. It's not good for them, and it's not good for the future of the country.
Well, just picking up on that theme, in the polls with young people, every institution, churches, whatever, all have dropped precipitously in their estimation of having trust in them. What's going on, do you think?
Well, I think you mentioned churches. People look at the TV evangelism scandals and some of the other things going on the various denominations. They see faith is not relevant to their lives in many cases. Another Gallup poll showed 20% of Generation Z say none when asked for their religious affiliation. You look at the political parties that increasingly seem to pander to the extremes, both right and left. Kristen Sinema brought this up recently, independent now senator from Arizona, when she appeared on Face the Nation. She was asked by the host, Margaret Brennan, well, how come you didn't go to the Republican Party after leaving the Democratic Party? She said, I don't want to go from one broken party to another. So I think there's a lot of cynicism out there about the two political parties, that no matter who gets elected, the problems never get fixed. We have a debt of over $31 trillion, and the Democrats say you can't cut a dime, and the Republicans come up with a plan to cut just $4 trillion plus, and yet the Democrats won't budge on it. People look at this and they say, that's not how things work in my life. That's not how things work in my business. But government has become so dysfunctional now because it's all about getting reelected and raising money. It's not about actually solving problems, because once you solve a problem, you no longer have the issue.
Staying with religion for just a second, you define yourself as both a Christian and a conservative. On the Christian front, I'm wondering what you think the role of Christianity is in the public sphere today in an increasingly secular and multi-ethnic society.
Well, that's been an ongoing question, really, since the rise of the so-called religious right in the 80s, but it precedes that as well. When King David was king over Israel, he had one of the greatest political statements ever. He said, "Put not your trust in princes and kings or in mortal flesh that cannot save." So I think there is a role for the universal church to assert right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil. I think of people like the late Roman Catholic Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, who said, among other things, America is not over overrun with intolerance or the bigoted, it's overrun by tolerance. We now tolerate everything. And if you say anything is wrong, any lifestyle, any behavioral choice, then you're branded a bigot or one of many phobes. So I think the church and preachers in the past, certainly the end of slavery, certainly the abolitionist movement, the church was much behind that, at least in the North, not so much in the South. So it does have a moral role that I think impacts our political life.
Define your brand of conservatism.
Well, conserve means to preserve, I think. And I think there are certain rules that always work. Living within your means as an individual and living within our means as a government. Don't spend more than you take in. Don't get in debt. Get married before you have kids. Stay in school. Study hard. Be honest in your personal and business relationships. These are values and virtues that have always worked when applied by individuals and nations. But we seem to be getting away from that now. Everybody has their own truth. You have your truth, I have my truth, and even if they contradict each other, the only thing that matters is that each of us feels good. Well, how's that working out?
Primary goal of Christian conservatives over the past 40 years has been the overturning of Roe v. Wade. What are you thinking about the impact of the Dobbs decision so far on society?
Well, I've always said that abortion is not the cause of our decadence, it's a reflection of it. And we see challenges to human life in the streets of Chicago and New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Houston and other major cities. Life is so cheap now, people shooting each other, people pushing people on subway tracks, all kinds of terrible things. So I think all of these are interrelated. I think the pregnancy help centers, at which I've spoken for many years around the country, are doing a tremendous job, and I think that their role will increase in the years to come. Most women I have spoken with who have had abortions and regret them say if they had had information about alternatives, if they'd seen a sonogram, if they knew about these help centers, if they had a place to live after they'd been thrown out of their house, then they would have made a different decision. So I think the momentum is on the side of the pro-lifers, but we have to continue to demonstrate our compassion for women and for the babies after they're born.
Analyze it politically. What do you see as the impacts, particularly going into 2024?
Well, it's been a winning issue depending on who you are and what you're running on. Certainly in some states, more liberal states like Minnesota, for example, it's a challenge. But George W. Bush ran as a pro-life president. Even Donald Trump ran as a pro-lifer after being for years a supporter of Planned Parenthood and named 3 Supreme Court justices who were on the side of the Dobbs decision in overturning Roe. So I think it's going to be a continuing debate. The Democrats, and especially the left, want it to be a top issue in the coming elections and future elections, but I'm not sure it's playing all that well. I think people are starting to realize the corrosive effect of doing away with 60 million babies in this country. That's a lot.
Tell me about your new book. It's titled A Watchman in the Night.
I picked this from a verse in the Old Testament when the ancient Israelites put a watchman on the wall after the city gates closed to look out for invading armies and other bad guys wanting to come in and burglarize the Jewish people. It's an analogy of standing and looking for threats to the United States and to us as individuals from the outside. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, not only from the obvious ones with threats from China and Russia and Iran and terrorist groups and whoever's coming across the southern border, but in our personal lives. We don't model the kind of traditional values as they used to be called anymore. You tune in the media and you see all kinds of what I would regard as terrible things. I guess I'm viewed as a dinosaur by some people. Dinosaurs are extinct. I hope I'm not yet, but I think certain values go on, and I've tried to write about those and call people back to those values because they actually do work.
One of the themes that you return to again and again in the book is the liberal media bias. I'm wondering, again, we talked about how this business that we're both in has changed, but one of the big changes has been the rise of conservative voices, talk radio, Fox News, Fox's competitors, obviously social media, blogs, etc. So is it as much of a concern as it was 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I've seen this, and I don't like what's happening because people tune in now only to those things that reinforce what they already believe. You mentioned Fox, MSNBC, if those are the two extremes, right and left. You got CNN, which is kind of quasi in the middle, back and forth. And when I was growing up and starting out as a copy boy at NBC News here in Washington, we had real journalists coming over from newspapers and wire services who wrote all their own stuff. Probably most, if not all, were Democrats, but they were really fair. David Brinkley once said, "It's impossible to be objective, so we must try to be fair." I think that's a wonderful standard for journalism. But so many people now see the media as opinion. There are opinion pages on in the newspapers, but now it looks like all of it is opinion. A friend of mine, a talk show host named Chris Plant, says the great power that the media have is the power to ignore the stories they don't cover. They start with a narrative and it comes from their political worldview, and then they shape that narrative to report on stories that are really not the entire story.
Your book is constructed to go through year by year, 1984 to the present, and we're going to do a little of the same. We also have some clips. I'm going to warn you, some of them, one from each decade, just look back over time. But before we get into that, you've dedicated this book to the memory of your daughter. Will you tell me about her?
Oh my, well, Carrie was probably more like me than any of my kids. Her personality, she was a sweetheart. And I loved her a lot. She passed away from a brain tumor, had a long struggle with it, had a lot of other difficult relational problems in her life, but I wanted to dedicate it to her because I miss her every day, but I know I'll see her again, so that's always a great comfort.
She followed you into journalism, did she?
Yeah, she worked for the Washington Examiner for a while, and then Town Hall, and then her malady got too severe and wasn't able to do it anymore, and we moved her into our house, and that was a special time just to be with her every day like we were when she was a child.
Well, while we're talking about sadness in your family, I also want to have you have a happy note, because in the book you tell us about a happy circumstance. Your wife of many years passed away, but I'm going to be a little sentimental here. You've got a new relationship in your life that's a really old relationship at the same time.
My wonderful wife, Christy Jean, who owns a fabulous restaurant in Key Largo, Florida, keeps me in food. We were high school classmates. We both worked at the same radio station when we were 16 years old. She was the prettiest girl in school, still is, and was squiring around celebrities, and I was on the air as a disc jockey at the age of 16, and we kept up at reunions and other things over the years, and both of our longtime spouses passed away within a couple of months of each other, and one thing led to another, and we reconnected, and I tell people I feel like I'm 17 again if I only had the body.
And you're living mostly in Florida then?
Yes, living in Miami, and a no-tax state, thank you, Ron DeSantis. And I felt like I got a pay raise the minute I moved there.
So into the chronology of the book, it begins in 1984 when your column began, halfway through Ronald Reagan's term. When Ronald Reagan died in 2004, you wrote, "Few presidents in modern times have so dominated or changed a world." So 40 years on, what's his legacy been?
Well, of course, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, which came down under George Bush 41, but the seeds were sown in the Reagan administration when he stood up to the Soviet Union, Gorbachev. You may recall, in I think it was 1983, he put Pershing missiles in Eastern Europe to counter the Soviet buildup there, and the American left was screaming that he was going to create World War III, and instead he caused the Soviets to back down, and that began the process that has opened up Eastern Europe and given them freedom, unlike they have anything they've seen for decades. So I think that is a lasting legacy. He raised taxes, but he lowered taxes. He named Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, the first woman on the court, which is a good thing. But she voted to uphold Roe versus Wade, and some people warned that her record was kind of spotty. Gee, where have we heard that before? But I think he was one of the few presidents I've met, and I've met everyone since JFK, that the presidency didn't change him. He knew who he was before he came to office, and he left the same afterwards. And he was probably the most optimistic president of all the ones that I've met. Just an incredible personality, a wonderful human being. I had lunch with him once in the White House. I remember he said, people think this job is all powerful, but I'll frequently give an order and see it frustrated 3 or 4 levels down. That was before the swamp name came to prominence.
So the government grew under Ronald Reagan,
Yes.
and he came into office wanting to cut the size of government. How do you process that?
Well, Reagan used to say that the only proof of eternal life in Washington is a government program. And I added that it's easier to kill a vampire than a government program. And the analogy, I think, is a good one because both suck the lifeblood out of their hosts. He tried to eliminate the Department of Education, which in my view, and his view too, was really not doing anything to educate young people. It was just another bureaucratic office promised by Jimmy Carter to the teachers' unions in 1976 if they would support him. But he was unable to do it because Congress wouldn't do it. It's almost impossible to cut anything. Even the rate of spending increases in this town, not a real cut. This is why I love Citizens Against Government Waste. They put out this annual pig book, and they go from A to Z in government agencies, and all of the waste from snail darters to studying whales and all these other things that really are unconstitutional, frankly. And then, of course, they say nothing can be cut at all. But I do think that Reagan had a lasting legacy, especially his optimism about the future of the country. Even in his last letter to the American people when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, said the best days of America are ahead. We need to hear more of that.
Well, 2 other issues from President Reagan's legacy. In 1986, he signed a major immigration bill. I think it was Simpson-Mazzoli,
Yes.
it was called. It was a watershed in U.S. immigration policy. This week, we are facing a real tidal wave of immigration after the COVID regulations go down. How do you think that legislation got us to where we are today, and what are you thinking about how we handle immigration?
Well, first, as Alan Simpson, the senator from Wyoming, told me, the problem with that legislation is that it did not have a secure identifier. It did not have a requirement that businesses not hire illegals. And it was something like the Jim Wright versus Bush 41 promise, when Jim Wright promised to cut spending if Bush 41 would raise taxes. Well, Bush 41 raised the taxes, but he never got the spending cuts. So I think this is a continuing scenario in Washington where things never change, they only get worse. And there are laws already on the books about immigration, about orderly entry into the country, about legal entry, and they're not being enforced. And that's the big frustration for me. We cannot handle these hundreds of thousands and maybe millions now of people coming into the country. As I wrote in a previous book, one of the characteristics of the decline of nations is uncontrolled immigration without assimilation. We are becoming hyphenated Americans, tribal Americans. Instead of out of many, one, our national motto, we're becoming out of one, many. And there are people who actually don't love this country, at least the way it is, and want to change it. And this is one of the ways they're planning to do it. Recall President Obama said we want to fundamentally transform America. And President Biden has said the same thing. Well, from what to what? The America I received from my parents and grandparents looked pretty good to me.
One last question on the Reagan legacy, and that was an era of being tough on crime. And you write in the book that your views have evolved in this area. How so?
Well, he wasn't the first, of course. Nixon made a big deal out of crime in his 1968 run for president. It's always been a problem, and I think when you don't enforce the law, you send a signal to the lawless that what they're doing is okay. You look what's happening in New York City with Alvin Bragg, and reducing felonies to misdemeanors, letting people back out on the street to commit new crimes. You just can't do this. If criminals know that they can get away with things, then they're going to get away with things. And I think a lack of respect for the law goes along with the other things we've been talking about, a decline in the respect and trust in the media and all institutions. You mentioned the church and government and everything. I think it's not just one thing, it's everything. And we need the kind of leadership, in my judgment, in this country who will return to basic rule of law, who will restore integrity and faith in some of our institutions. Because if we don't have faith in them, where are we going to go? What nation are we going to go to? If it's not America, where? If it's not us, who? Sound like a campaign speech.
But did I misread you? Because my takeaway from what you wrote is that you began to believe that that nonviolent misdemeanors should not be incarcerated.
Right.
The prison population was growing too much. Is that correct?
Yes, that is. And I'll tell you why. There's an Old Testament requirement of paying back people you have wronged. It's called restitution. So if I steal your TV set and I go to jail for it, sure, you may have insurance to get it back, but what does that do to the relationship between you and me and your property? Very little. If you force somebody to pay back double or triple what they have done to injure you through your stealing of your TV set or whatever it may be, then you have a moral element involved in this that you don't have when you just lock somebody up. And you know, remember that great line from the Shawshank Redemption where the Tom Hanks character is saying to Red, you know, I was an honest man on the outside. I had to come in here to learn to be a criminal.
We're going to move into the late 80s, the election of George H.W. Bush. And first of all, what do you think overall of his presidency?
Well, I knew him for many years. He was my congressman when I lived in Houston and worked at a television station there. I think the Bush family is a wonderful family. I've known many of them, 41, 43. I met some of the others, Jeb, when he was governor of Florida. Had lunch with him recently. And they're people of great integrity, and they love this country, and they believe in the values that built and have sustained it. But I think we've moved on, unfortunately, from that kind of thing. Now we're just shouting at each other across the political divide. You look at television, which enhances this sort of thing, and you've got a host and two guests, and one guest says, "You're ruining America," and the other guest said, "No, you're ruining America." "Well, you're a commie." "Well, you're a secular humanist." "Well, you're a Bible-thumping bigot." And the host says, and we'll be back with more civil discussion after these messages. Real people don't behave like that. And so we've got, you know, the extremes now, and they're the ones who win the primaries, and people are increasingly frustrated. That's why independents are the most rapidly growing party, if you want to call it a party, right now.
First clip. This is from 1989, and it is about the collapse of the Soviet Union. You talked about how important that was and that President Reagan set the stage. Let's listen to what you had to say about it back then.
I just got through doing a column for my papers this week on while Secretary Baker is trying to form a unanimity of at least opinion on the outside in terms of our approach to the Soviet Union, his own State Department has just released about 90 days ago a report on the continuation of the disinformation and front groups and infiltration and forgery letters that are being used not only by the Soviets, but Soviet bloc countries to oppose American policy and to try to weaken support for the United States government, even within our own country.
Ooh, well, I grew the mustache to make me look older and more mature, and it worked. It was also before my hair transplant, but that's another issue. Wow, it's a great voice. So what did you...
We picked that because of the disinformation, something that has continued to be a theme. This was in the pre-internet days, and you were railing about Soviet disinformation, now Russian disinformation in American politics. How do we counteract it?
Well, we have disinformation in America. We don't have to import it from other countries. I think people have to be careful where they get their news sources, especially now that we're faced with AI, and where people can create anything. A friend of mine who has a podcast decided to create himself on AI, and he said the voice was incredibly like his. He almost couldn't tell the difference. And this, you know, Elon Musk has warned about this, and others have as well. So I think our threats now are less from Russian and Chinese disinformation than they are from disinformation within our own country. You have to do your due diligence on this stuff. You know, democracy, a constitutional republic, is not the natural state of the world. If it were, more people would embrace it. You have totalitarianism, you have religious fundamentalism, denial of women's rights all over the world. And so we need to work at this. You can't get in shape by watching an exercise video. You've got to go to the gym. And you can't maintain a constitutional republic just by voting every couple or 4 years. You've got to be engaged every day.
How should we think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, in light of Putin's incursion into Ukraine?
Well, I was standing on the White House lawn when Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat signed the peace agreement. And there was somebody standing next to me who said, "Isn't this wonderful? Peace is finally broken out." And I said, with the deep cynicism that comes with being in this business, there will always be other enemies. And so there are. One thing collapses, another rises. One dictator dies, another goes up. And so I think there's always been evil in the world since the Garden of Eden. And we have to stand against it and fight against it and resist it. There's a verse in Scripture that says, "Resist the devil and he will flee from you." I think that works in theological terms, and it also works among foreign policy and other areas.
When you mentioned Menachem Begin, let me divert from the late 80s to today. Israel is celebrating its 75th anniversary as a country. At the same time, massive protests on the street about the proposed changes to the judicial system. What do you see from afar about what's going on there?
Well, I just got back from my 27th visit to Israel. Had another.
Now, why do you go so often?
I just love the country. I've known Benjamin Netanyahu since he was Deputy Chief of Mission here at the Israeli Embassy in Washington. He's been an old friend. I read his autobiography called Bibi, and he deals quite on many pages about the need for judicial reform in Israel and how the judiciary and the left-wing media in Israel have been after him for years. They can't defeat him at the polls. This is his third time around. I told him, I said, you know, Jesus only promised a second coming, and this is your third coming. He liked that. But I think he's been a very effective leader. And he, you know, you'll remember that speech he gave at the UN where he had the chart of that drawing of a bomb and Iran's progress. He told me that we have only been able to, we being Israel and himself, been only able to delay the bomb that Iran will get. But somebody's going to have to stop them. Now, who's that going to be? Certainly not under this administration, which continues to pressure Israel to embrace the so-called two-state solution. So I think it's going to have to be Israel. I think they've been doing some things that a lot of the world doesn't know, but somebody's going to have to do it because Iran has said they want to obliterate Israel. They think they have a direct order from their God to do so and then to come after us. That's pretty hard to counter.
You describe it as the so-called two-state solution.
Yeah.
What is the answer to the Palestinian situation?
Well, first of all, you have to look at the history. The Palestinians are people who came from Jordan. Remember Black September when the first King Hussein threw out Yasser Arafat and the rest of them for trying to bring him down to stage a coup. And so Arafat created this Palestinian group of people and put a bunch of them in Lebanon and then called in the cameras to show them, quote, suffering, unquote. None of the Arab nations would help them. Arafat certainly wouldn't help them. The UN wouldn't help them, really. Get out of their circumstances. So I think the answer is, in my view, and Caroline Glick, who used to write for the Jerusalem Post and now is a podcaster, I met with her over there again too, has said that the answer is just to declare no two-state solution, absorb the Palestinians, and move on. They're not going to get another state because just as in Gaza, which I wrote about as well, if they gave up Gaza without any kind of reciprocity, there are going to be missiles in there and terrorist bases, and so there were. I mean, you have to listen to what they say. They say that they being the Islamic extremists, they want to destroy Israel, kill the Jewish people, and take over all the land. I mean, I think you have to take them at their word, given their behavior.
Last question about George H.W. Bush, Bush 41 president. You write about this, and he even spoke about it, the vision thing for a president, and the criticism that he didn't have one. How important is that, really?
Well, I think it's extremely important. You know, going back to Scripture again, it says, without a vision, the people perish. People want to know where they're being led, whether it's in warfare or in politics. You have to have people in your government who say, this is where I want to take our country, and this is why I want to take it there, and this is why it's going to benefit you and the entire country if I am able to take it there. That's what people want to hear. They're tired of all of this, at least I am. I think a lot of other people too. As soon as we get a majority, we're going to investigate you, and oh yeah, well, when we get a majority back, we're going to investigate you. Well, we're going to indict your relatives. Well, we're going to indict your relatives. We're going to hold hearings to show how corrupt you are. How does that help any American? How does that produce jobs? How does that produce a better education, especially for inner city and poor children? It doesn't do anything. It raises money for the extremes. It raises money for ads on TV, but it doesn't really promote the general welfare, provide for the common defense, or ensure domestic tranquility. Wish I'd written that.
In our last presidential election, did the two candidates each successfully outline their vision for the country?
No. And that's one of the reasons that I think people are so frustrated. I mean, you get all of this stuff from one side. Don't elect Trump because he's a really bad man. Well, don't elect Biden because he's an even worse man. And how is that helping anybody? I want to hear what their vision is for the country. Again, about the debt, about uncontrolled immigration, about crime. So many of these other things that are real issues. We need to solve Social Security and Medicare. Everybody knows it's going to run out of money. Social Security will in 10 years. But if politicians solve a problem, they no longer have the issue. And they'd rather have the issue than to solve the problem. That's the dirty little secret of this town. I'll tell you a quick story about my late friend, George McGovern, the 1972 Democratic presidential candidate, who'd come back from World War II and done nothing other than public service. So when he lost in the Reagan landslide of 1980, along with 4 other Democratic senators, he decided to do something different. He went up to Connecticut and bought an inn, tried to run it. Well, it soon went out of business. A Wall Street Journal reporter called him up and wanted to know what happened. And then the only thing you need to know about what happens to people who stay too long in office in this town, George McGovern said, gee, if I knew how difficult it was to run a business, I might have voted differently in the Senate. That's all you need to know. When they stay too long, they get used to the environment and all the perks that go with it. Patrick Leahy once said, I've been in this town 40 years. Yeah, that's the problem.
You mentioned George McGovern as a longtime friend.
Yeah.
In the book, you also write about Senator Ted Kennedy and say he was a very good friend of 25 years. Do those kinds of relationships still happen in this town today?
No. When I was young, there were mostly women who threw these wonderful parties, and they would invite people, Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, sports figures, judges, and they'd eat over the shrimp bowl and get to know each other. There's a great video on YouTube of Reagan paying tribute to Speaker Tip O'Neill at an event, a St. Patrick's Day event in Boston. I think it was 1987. And he's kidding him, and they're laughing, and he's calling O'Neill a great patriot and a dear friend. You don't have any of that today. The story was, they'd argue during the day over issues, and then O'Neill would come over to the White House at night. They'd have a couple of drinks together, and they'd work things out. 2 Irishmen with similar backgrounds. You just don't have that today. With the cell phones, if you go out to dinner with a member of the other party, somebody will take a picture and use it against you in the next campaign. And it's very sad. It really is. It's not the Washington I grew up with.
We are more than halfway through our hour with Cal Thomas about his new book, A Watchman in the Night, and almost the 40th anniversary of his syndicated column. We're into the 1990s, the era of Bill Clinton. You are critical of both Bill and Hillary Clinton throughout the book. Why?
Well, I think they used each other, frankly, to get to the top. You remember that famous 60 Minutes interview when he was first a candidate, in which Hillary said that I'm not any stay-at-home Tammy Wynette, stand by your man kind of person. She knew that he had been unfaithful while he was governor of Arkansas, but they had made a deal with each other, a little like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. It was said that Fred Astaire gave Ginger Rogers class and she gave him sex. Well, Hillary gave Bill cover because she didn't, walk out on him. And I would say that he used her to get to the White House. I mean, he had a great personality, just like Barack Obama. I mean, I met both of them. I think, I could have dinner with him and we could laugh and we could tell jokes and do other things. And that's one of the key gifts, I think, of a politician. And by the way, Clinton was the last president to actually have a balanced budget. Most people don't know that, which was pretty amazing. And he engaged with Newt Gingrich, then the Speaker of the House, in the welfare reform, which was a tremendous thing. The left screamed and yelled that people would starve in the streets. They didn't. They got jobs. They got off welfare, which had become a drug for them. So that kind of stuff has disappeared as well. Now, Kevin McCarthy wants to talk to President Biden about, the debt limit and other things. And this is what's needed. whether they're going to have an honest conversation and actually produce results, we'll soon know.
Well, it took a government shutdown for them to reach the agreement on the debt.
You know, that thing, this has been going on for years, the threat of a government shutdown. The government's not going to shut down. And the cameras go out to the national parks and they put up a closed sign and they'll find somebody who didn't get a certain kind of government check. It's all kabuki theater. It's all meaningless. It's all a bad rerun that we've seen over and over and over again.
So when Newt Gingrich helped to engineer the Republican takeover of the House for the first time in 40 years during the Clinton administration, you said that later on, when you talked with Gingrich, he admitted that they squandered the opportunity. How so?
Well, the Republicans are always embarrassed when they get power. The Democrats use power. There's only one reason to get it, and that's to use it. But the Republicans read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the editorial writers, the columnists and everything, who are always beating up on them. And they cower in fear. Instead, they ought to just cancel their subscriptions, turn off their TVs, and do what they were elected to do. And I think that, Newt had a plan for Republican majority in the House, and it worked. But then they had this retreat. I know Rush Limbaugh talked about this. He was asked to speak on that retreat, and he was encouraging them to go for it now. You've got the power, go for it. Cut the taxes, reduce the size of government, commit yourself to more freedom, individual liberty, and all of those other things that the Constitution stands for. But I think some Republicans, not all of them, but enough, were reluctant to do it because, again, they read the criticism and they were afraid of being called racists and various kinds of phobes and intolerant and bigoted and all these other things.
So right now, are you cheering on the standoff over the debt limit?
No, I don't. Again, it's all political theater. I've seen it so many times before. And there is no debt limit if they keep raising it. I mean, what is the point of having a debt limit if you're going to raise it every time it comes up? The government isn't suffering from too little money. You know, once again, Ronald Reagan says we have a debt not because the American people are taxed too little, but because their government spends too much. That's the issue. If you get a credit card bill in the mail and you've kind of gone wild in shopping and restaurants and you bought a bunch of stuff that you really can't afford, what do? Do you go borrow money and then keep spending? You don't, I hope. I don't, but the government does. And that's why, the interest on the debt is greater than the GDP of many nations. We can't go on like this, but who's going to say stop?
Next clip is from 1998, and this is you talking about Ken Starr's Whitewater investigation. Let's watch this. Out here, this viewer writes, we're hearing that we have spent $40 million in 4 years tearing the state of Arkansas pillar to post to determine whether or not Bill Clinton knew that David Hale, the president of the local company, was making a $300,000 loan to Jim McDougal, the president of the local savings and loan.
Well, again, as Judge Starr has said, if people were more forthcoming with evidence, with records, the investigation could have been wrapped up a very long time ago. But it's tough, and these people are very good at it. They've had a lot of experience. The Arkansas time was a great preparation. It was sort of like the minor leagues, the farm team for the big time. And if you've made a career out of dissembling and deceiving and destroying and denying, you've gotten a lot of experience that you can use with good effect at the national level, and that's what this administration, in my judgment, is doing, and quite effectively.
Cal Thomas pulled that clip to talk to you about impeachment. President Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives. The country had gone 132 years since the last and only impeachment, and we've now seen 3 in 20 years. Why?
It's payback time, and that's one of the things that, unless you're on the extremes, that people are fed up with. Again, this doesn't improve any life, doesn't educate a child. And when the Republicans did that to Clinton, you knew the Democrats were going to get their chance, and they did the same thing to Trump twice. And now we're hearing even talk that Biden could be impeached. Well, that's not going to go anywhere with a Democrat Senate. And it's just crazy. I mean, who's going to stand up and say, enough of this stupidity? Let's get on with solving the business of the American people, which has nothing to do with your careers, okay? We hired you to serve us. We're not serving you. That's the difference. The Constitution begins, we the people, not you the government.
So 2000 election and the arrival of George W. Bush. First question I have for you, what was the impact on the Supreme Court of their intervention in the 2000 election outcome?
Well, I think for some it deepened the cynicism. You remember hanging chads and the Secretary of State of Florida finally declaring that Bush was the winner in that state. Now, I will say, to the great credit of Al Gore, Bush's opponent, he did not contest the election. He did not say it was stolen, much like Nixon in 1960 against Kennedy, when he could have had a legitimate reason for claiming that that election was stolen due to Kennedy's father and some of the things he did in Cook County, Illinois, and in West Virginia. Al Gore went quietly and said, for the sake of the country, I concede to my opponent. That is not going to happen probably again in my lifetime, and maybe for another lifetime or two. Things are so close now. You have just a very few states based on their electoral votes that decide any election. And now with AI and with the Democrats especially targeting young people, you saw what happened recently in Wisconsin with a Supreme Court race up there where they flipped from a pro-life state Supreme Court, or from a pro-life to a pro-choice state Supreme Court. They made great use of targeting young people who hadn't voted before. I think you're going to see more of that.
9/11. So how do you look at that moment in history and what its impact has been on the country and the world?
I was living in Alexandria, Virginia at the time, and I'm working on my computer, and my wife said, quick, turn on the TV. I turned it on and watched with the rest of America as those planes crashed into the Twin Towers in New York, and then the one in the Pentagon just down the road from where I was living. I think I wrote 10 columns in a row on the thing. I think more than any other subject I've ever written about in a row. And it was frightening. We felt vulnerable. We couldn't fly anywhere commercially. I heard military jets going up and down the Potomac River near my house. And when Bush went up to New York and somebody in the crowd yelled, "We can't hear you," and he said, "Well, I hear you, and pretty soon they're going to hear us." That was an amazing moment. And I think it was a rare moment when the country united behind the President of the United States as one. We haven't seen that since. And we can argue about whether we stayed too long in Afghanistan or not. I think we did. And we can argue about whether we withdrew precipitously, and I think we did. Trump's line was, well, I was going to withdraw too, but I was going to withdraw in a more orderly fashion and wouldn't have left all the military equipment behind. But I think it shows that we are still vulnerable. There are people who want to destroy us, and we better stop destroying ourselves from within. We got plenty of enemies from without.
You mentioned the Afghanistan war, but you haven't mentioned, but you do write about the Iraq war. What do you think of the decision to go into Iraq? It
was, in retrospect, a bad decision. It was bad intelligence. I mean, when Colin Powell went to the UN and showed these pictures and claimed that they showed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that was the rationale. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of the UK, was operating on the same intelligence and saying the same thing. But it was bad. It was wrong. And is it good that Saddam Hussein is gone? Probably. Is the way we got rid of him, was that the best way? Probably not. No weapons of mass destruction were found. And, there are a lot of people that what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex want to keep getting us into wars because it feeds their power and the defense industry and their weapons, selling not only to our government, but also to governments around the world. So I think we need to be more careful, and I think we need to have Congress more involved, which the Constitution says only the Congress can declare war. We've had these conflicts. Korea was a conflict. Vietnam was a conflict. There was no declared war in any of these, and I think we need to have limits on what one person can do to commit the United States and our men and women to give their lives or be injured before we get into these affairs. We need to think them through.
At the end of the Bush years, we had the 2007-2008 financial crisis and the accompanying bailout package. This is our third clip. This is you in February 26, 2009, as the big economic stimulus package was being debated in this town.
The American dream is being borrowed. This is not taxpayers' money. This is being borrowed from other countries, mainly China, possibly Saudi Arabia. We are so in debt now to other countries. What this economic stimulus plan is all about
There's an old song, I think it was in the 70s, let the devil take tomorrow, help me make it through the night. That is what this plan is about. Never mind tomorrow. The tax increases aren't going to come until 2011. And that'll be after the next election, and you won't actually pay them until 2012. So, yes, there's a lot of stuff going on out there, but it's on borrowed money.
A familiar song for you.
Yes, well, I keep getting older in these clips, but at least I got rid of the mustache. It turned out that the stimulus worked to a point, but like the saving of the auto industry, which at least the money got paid back, what we are doing, and we've seen this recently with the Silicon Valley Bank and some others, we are rewarding bad behavior. Failure is not a bad thing if it leads to good behavior. I've been fired, I have failed in some areas, and I've always learned from those lessons. But if you know that you can get bailed out, whether it be by the FDIC or some other government agency for doing bad loans, giving mortgages to people who can't afford them. Look at this recent proposal from the Biden administration. The president wants to subsidize people with bad credit by raising the mortgage rates for people with good credit. Now, what in the world is that all about? I thought you used to penalize bad behavior in order to get good behavior and rewarded good behavior to get more of it. Now we seem to have flipped that.
Of Barack Obama, you write, I allowed my joy at the possibilities of seeing a black man elected president to overcome my natural skepticism that a liberal Democrat would change his spots. You also say Barack Obama would prove to be a very divisive president.
I met him once. He has a tremendous personality, and I was proud and still remain proud that this nation, with its history of slavery and discrimination and Jim Crow and the rest, could elect a man with skin color darker than white people. And I said so at the time. I grew up in segregated Washington. I went to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech when I was a copy boy at NBC. I was dragged along by a reporter. I never really met a black person other than the maid my parents employed until I started playing basketball and showered with them and went to their homes and had dinner with them. I remember the late Jack Kemp, the congressman from New York and later HUD secretary, said he had showered with more black men than existed in the Republican Party at the time. It was a great line. But he had credibility with them because not only did he play football with them and shower with them, but he went to their communities and he talked their language, and he really had a heart. He used to call himself a bleeding heart conservative. And that was a great line. But he wanted to make their lives better, not just to subsidize them in their poverty. And I think President Obama missed a tremendous opportunity. I think I referred to him once as a potential Moses leading poor minority people out of their failing government schools, out of their housing projects, and giving them new hope for a brighter future. That, I think, is the tragedy of his 8 years in office, that he did not do that.
Our time is evaporating. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to fast forward to Donald Trump. You write that you initially opposed his candidacy. How did you come around to supporting him?
Well, I made a bargain with the devil. I said, okay, I'm going to ignore all of the character qualities, and I'm going to focus on the policies. And his policies were good for the most part, whether it was the border or taxes, government regulations. But I think in the end, his personality and his character overcame those things. And we want or expect or hope for certain things in our political leadership, certainly in the presidency. And while we allow certainly certain moral failings in some areas, I think we'd never had a divorced president or a president who was married to somebody who had been divorced until Gerald Ford and Betty Ford. And then, Reagan, of course, had been divorced, and then we kind of tolerated Clinton because, as James Carville said, it's only sex. And now we've gotten to a point where here is Trump on, wife number 3 or 4, I lost count, and all of these accusations made against him. And I just think that at a certain point, character overcomes everything else. And I'm certainly not supporting him in the next election. I hope somebody younger and with better character qualities gets the nomination. I believe they will.
How responsible is he for January 6th?
People are responsible for their own behavior. I mean, there are, every time you see something on television that represents violence or severe criticism of somebody else, that doesn't justify your going out and doing harm to other people and their property or trying to reverse an election. So that's going to be a matter, I think, for the special counsel to determine. But those people on January 6th, not all of whom, by the way, rioted. There were a number out there exercising their First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble and to address their government for redress of their grievances. So the ones that did invade the Capitol and the ones that did destroy property deserved to be held accountable. But whether Trump himself incited that riot is a matter now for the special counsel to determine.
How do you process his handling of the COVID epidemic?
I think he listened too much to Dr. Fauci. I think shutting down everything was the wrong thing to do. Governor DeSantis of Florida had a different plan, and it worked out much better, and he has touted that. And then he was all over the place. This hydroxychloroquine, or whatever it was, and all of these, bathtub gin type of remedies talking about. And again, it was more about his personality than other things. I think shutting down the country was a very bad thing.
You criticized Barack Obama for excessive use of executive orders, but his two successors continue to deploy them.
Mark Levin did a show the other night on Fox where he went through Article 1 of the Constitution and talked about the limitations of a president. The founders wrote all this stuff, and they wanted government and political power to be limited so the American people would be unlimited. And these executive orders have no constitutional basis. They're not going through Congress. They're not being approved by the people's elected representatives. And I think it's a very dangerous precedent. And you're going to see more of this if it's allowed to continue. I wish a case would come before the Supreme Court and they could decide this, because you're going to get how many? I think it was close to 100 executive orders that Biden did when he first came into office. Now, if a Republican gets elected, they're going to reverse all those executive orders, and they're going to issue their own executive orders. Then the next election, if a Democrat gets elected, it's the same thing all over again. It's like watching a tennis match. The ball's going back and forth. That's nuts. That's not orderly government.
Earlier, you referenced Donald Trump's 3 appointees to the Supreme Court. We now have a conservative majority. What are your expectations of it?
Well, of course, some of my best expectation was the Dobbs decision, which I think if you read the decision, along with those who agreed with it on the court, you're going to find that the legal analysis, the legal argument that Roe was wrongly decided, something even Lawrence Tribe, who favored the outcome, the Harvard professor, agreed was wrongly decided. You're going to find the logic very, very good. I'm hoping that more cases on religious freedom, on tariffs maybe, and some other things will be decided. But I think these justices are men and women of strong character. I'm appalled at the demonstrations outside of their homes and the death threats that they're getting. I think this shows once again that the political left in this country has been using the courts to get through things they could never get through Congress.
We have 5 minutes left. We are 2 years into the Biden administration, someone that you've had 40 years of observations. How is he governing versus the man that you watched as a public official all those years?
Well, I'm very sad for him. I really am, because it's very clear that he is in decline. He can't put a simple sentence together. Of course, neither can Kamala Harris, but that's another issue. And he's confused most of the time. He hasn't done a press conference, a real press conference, in some time. He did an interview the other day with MSNBC, and a White House staffer interrupted the interview because she didn't want him to answer the question that was asked. In all of my time in Washington and observing presidents, I've never seen that happen. And, his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, guides him around places. He's confused about where he goes. I don't think he's going to be the nominee. I mean, you've seen the recent Washington Post ABC poll, I think it was, that shows him 7 points behind Trump. That could be an outlier, but it's following a pattern where even Democrats, 58% of Democrats, according to that poll, want somebody else. They're afraid. And a lot of Republicans don't want Donald Trump either. So it's going to give me plenty to write about for the next year and a half.
Well, what about his record on his policy so far?
You mean President Biden? Well, he campaigned as a uniter and a moderate, but he is governed like the most extreme liberal, raising taxes, mandates about now washing machines. We're going to have less water in our washing machines, which means we'll probably have to wash 2 cycles instead of 1, which will use just as much, if not more, water. Regulating, trying to force electric cars on the public that doesn't want it. That's clear because Elon Musk has dropped the price of Tesla, I think 3 times now. People just aren't buying it. And I think a lot of his policies are based on philosophy more than actually what works. And I think that's dangerous for the country.
Big issue, but as we close out here, we are experiencing almost a weekly mass shooting in this country. What is the remedy, if there is one?
Well, I think it's an example that evil is reigning in the land. And I see a connection between abortion and the loss of human life in our cities. When you disrespect life at one level, you're going to disrespect it at other levels as well. It's a tragedy because most of the victims and most of the perpetrators are minorities. It's a tragedy because the police are being defunded. Many police officers are leaving the forces because they're not supported anymore by the politicians. And when you have a vacuum, the only thing I learned in physics before I flunked table of contents is that nature abhors a vacuum. There's always something ready to rush in to fill the vacuum. And if you have a vacuum created by politicians who will not uphold the law, if you have a vacuum created that there's no accountability for breaking the law or very little accountability, and people can not even go to prison but get right back out on the streets and commit new crimes, you're going to have anarchy in this country. And that's what we're seeing in city after city.
Cal Thomas's new book is called A Watchman in the Night. You referenced lots to write about over the next couple of years, so that you're not intending this to be your swan song.
Well, I hope not. No, I have a title for another book. I don't think I'll write it, but I love the title. Press 1 for English.
Well, thanks very much for being with us for the last hour. And your book is available wherever people buy books. And who's the publisher?
It's HumanX, which is a division of Newsmax. And I don't know if it's available. A lot of stores don't carry my books. They put one in the religion section some years ago, back next to the Zen and Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I said, this is not a religious book. Put it in the cookbook section. It's not a cookbook either, but it'll get more coverage.
Thanks again for your time. Susan. Appreciate it. Cal Thomas, longtime syndicated columnist and author of several books. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email about Q&A at podcasts@c-span.org. Send me your questions, your comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.